The morning sun painted golden streaks across the Rodriguez family's backyard as 6-year-old Emma skipped through the tall grass, her pink sundress fluttering like butterfly wings. She had convinced her grandmother, Abuela Rosa, to let her play outside while the adults prepared for Sunday dinner. The familiar woods behind the old farmhouse had always been Emma's playground, a magical kingdom where she was the princess and every tree held secrets waiting to be discovered. "Stay where I can see you, Mia," Abuela Rosa called from the kitchen window, her weathered hands busy kneading masa for tamales. Emma waved enthusiastically, her dark curls bouncing as she bent to examine a cluster of white wildflowers near the tree line. The woods beckoned with their mysterious shadows and dancing leaves, promising adventures that only a child's imagination could conjure. Emma had explored these woods countless times with her older brother Miguel, following worn deer paths and splashing in the shallow creek that wound through the forest. She knew every fallen log, every clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy like cathedral light. At least she thought she did. Today felt different, somehow magical, full of possibilities that made her 6-year-old heart race with excitement. A brilliant yellow butterfly landed on a nearby flower, its wings shimmering in the dappled sunlight. Emma gasped with delight and crept closer, her small hands outstretched. The butterfly fluttered away, leading her deeper into the woods with each graceful movement. Emma followed without hesitation, mesmerized by its beauty, her grandmother's warnings forgotten in the thrill of the chase. "Come back, little butterfly," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. She pushed through a cluster of berry bushes, their thorns catching at her dress, but not slowing her determined pursuit. The butterfly danced just ahead, always tantalizingly out of reach, leading her down paths she had never noticed before. The forest seemed to grow thicker around her. Ancient oaks stretched their gnarled branches overhead, creating a canopy so dense that the afternoon sun barely penetrated the shadows. Emma paused, suddenly aware that the familiar sounds of home, her grandmother's radio, the distant hum of traffic on Route 32, had faded to silence. Only the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of a crow broke the eerie quiet. "Abuela?" Emma called softly, her voice swallowed by the vast wilderness. She turned in a slow circle, trying to spot the yellow butterfly that had led her so far from safety, but it had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. For the first time, fear crept into her young heart like ice water in her veins. The trees all looked the same now, massive, imposing sentinels that seemed to close in around her small form. Emma tried to retrace her steps, but every path looked identical, every clearing a mirror of the last. Panic began to bubble in her chest as she realized the terrible truth. She was completely, utterly lost. "Mama, Papa," she cried, her voice cracking with terror. But only echoes answered back, mocking her desperation. Emma ran frantically through the underbrush, her pink dress catching on thorns, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. She called for her family until her throat was raw, until darkness began to creep through the forest like a living thing. Meanwhile, back at the farmhouse, Abuela Rosa dried her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch. "Emma, time for dinner," she called, expecting to see her granddaughter's bright smile appear from behind the garden shed. But the backyard was empty, filled only with the ominous silence of approaching dusk. "Emma?" Rosa's voice rose with concern as she walked to the edge of the woods. "Emma, this isn't funny. Come out right now." Her heart began to race as she called again and again, receiving no response. With trembling fingers, she dialed her son Carlos's number. "She's gone," Rosa whispered into the phone, her voice breaking. I looked away for just a few minutes to check the stove, and when I looked back, "Carlos, I can't find Emma anywhere." Within 20 minutes, the Rodriguez family had mobilized a search party. Carlos and his brothers combed the immediate area, while Maria called the police, her hands shaking so violently she could barely dial. Emma's older brother Miguel ran through the woods calling his sister's name, his young voice cracking with emotion and guilt. He should have been watching her, should have been there to protect her. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived just as the sun disappeared behind the trees, casting the forest into an inky darkness that seemed to swallow hope itself. A 15-year veteran of the county sheriff's department, Martinez had seen missing children cases before, and she knew that time was the enemy. Every minute that passed reduced the chances of finding Emma safe and sound. We need search teams, K-9 units, and volunteers organized into grid patterns. Martinez barked into her radio, taking control of what was rapidly becoming a massive operation. Soon, dozens of flashlight beams cut through the darkness like fallen stars, accompanied by the urgent calls of Emma's name echoing through the forest. Zeus, the department's star German shepherd, arrived with his handler, Officer Tom Bradley. The powerful dog immediately picked up Emma's scent from her favorite stuffed rabbit, his nose working with the precision of a finely tuned instrument. Martinez watched as Zeus led them deeper into the woods, following an invisible trail that only he could detect. Hour by hour, the search expanded. Volunteers from neighboring towns joined the effort, their faces grim with determination. Local news crews arrived, broadcasting Emma's photo and description across the region. The story spread like wildfire. 6-year-old girl missing in woods, police fear abduction. As the first night stretched into dawn, then into a second day, hope began to dim like a dying ember. Emma's parents refused to leave the command post Martinez had established at the forest's edge, clinging to each other and praying for a miracle. The detective had seen too many cases like this, knew the statistics by heart, but she pushed those dark thoughts away. Somewhere in those vast woods, a little girl was waiting to come home. By the third day, the unthinkable had become reality. Emma Rodriguez had vanished without a trace, and everyone feared the worst. The fourth dawn broke gray and cold over the forest, carrying with it the bitter taste of diminishing hope. Detective Sarah Martinez stood at the command post, her coffee long since gone cold in her trembling hands. Dark circles rimmed her eyes from 3 sleepless nights, and her uniform was wrinkled from countless hours in the field. Around her, exhausted volunteers prepared for what many feared would be their final search effort. The statistics were brutal and unforgiving. After 72 hours, missing children cases rarely ended with joyful reunions. Emma's parents, Carlos and Maria Rodriguez, sat on folding chairs beside the command tent, their faces hollow masks of grief and terror. Maria clutched Emma's favorite teddy bear, so tightly her knuckles had turned white, while Carlos stared blankly at the tree line that had swallowed his daughter whole. Neither had slept, neither had eaten, and both looked like they were aging, years with each passing hour. Officer Tom Bradley adjusted Zeus's tracking harness for what felt like the 100th time. The German shepherd had been working tirelessly, his powerful nose following scent trails that led nowhere, circling back on themselves in maddening loops that suggested Emma had wandered in confused circles. But Zeus was tireless, professional, and absolutely determined. His dark eyes held an intelligence that Bradley had learned to trust completely over their 5 years as partners. One more sweep of the northeastern quadrant, Martinez announced to the assembled teams, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried 3 days earlier. If we don't find anything by noon... She couldn't finish the sentence. Everyone understood. After noon, this would officially transition from a rescue operation to a recovery mission. Zeus led Bradley down a narrow deer path they had searched twice before, but the dog seemed more focused today, his tail rigid with concentration. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers, making visibility poor and adding an otherworldly quality to their desperate mission. Bradley checked his watch. 8:47 a.m. Just over 3 hours until hope officially died. Then, Zeus stopped abruptly, his entire body going rigid with alertness. His ears perked forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. Not distress, but recognition. Bradley's heart began to pound as he realized what that sound meant. After 5 years of partnership, he knew Zeus's vocabulary of sounds better than human speech. This wasn't the whine of following a cold trail. This was the sound Zeus made when he'd found what he was looking for. Martinez! Bradley shouted into his radio, his voice cracking with sudden excitement. Zeus has something. Grid referenced November 7 Charlie, about 200 yards past the fallen elm. The dog moved forward with renewed purpose, Bradley struggling to keep pace through the thick underbrush. Branches clawed at their uniforms as they pushed deeper into a section of forest that seemed untouched by human presence. The morning light filtered through the canopy in ethereal beams, illuminating a small clearing ahead where something pink caught Bradley's eye. There, curled in a hollow between two massive tree roots, lay Emma Rodriguez. She was alive, but barely. Recognizable as the bright, cheerful child who had vanished 4 days earlier. Her pink dress was shredded and filthy, her dark hair matted with leaves and mud. Scratches covered her arms and legs like a road map of terror, and her small body shook uncontrollably, even though she appeared to be sleeping. Zeus approached her. Slowly, his training overriding his natural protective instincts, and gently nuzzled her face with his wet nose. Emma's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, pure terror filled her gaze. Then she saw Zeus's gentle brown eyes and kind face, and something miraculous happened. Instead of screaming or running, she reached out with trembling fingers and buried them in the dog's thick fur. Zeus stood perfectly still, allowing the traumatized child to use him as an anchor to reality. "It's okay, sweetheart," Bradley whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt beside them. "You're safe now. We're going to take you home to Mama and Papa." Emma looked at him with wide, haunted eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged from her damaged throat. Within minutes, the clearing swarmed with rescue personnel. Paramedics arrived with a stretcher, but Emma refused to let go of Zeus, her small fists tangled in his, fur like lifelines. The dog seemed to understand his critical role in her rescue and remained motionless. Even when the medical team began their examination around him, Dr. Amanda Foster, the child psychologist who had been standing by at the command post, rushed to the scene with Martinez. She knelt beside Emma and spoke in the gentle, soothing voice she had perfected over years of working with traumatized children. "Hello, Emma. My name is Dr. Foster. Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere?" Emma's response sent chills through everyone present. "Bad man," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Big dog, scared." She pressed her face deeper into Zeus's fur, as if the animal could protect her from the memories that lurked in her young mind. The paramedics worked quickly, but carefully, checking for injuries while Emma maintained her death grip on Zeus. They found evidence of exposure, dehydration, and numerous scratches and bruises, but thankfully no signs of the worst-case scenarios everyone had feared. Still, Emma's fragmented words painted a terrifying picture that made Martinez's blood run cold. As they prepared to transport Emma to the hospital, she suddenly spoke again, her voice carrying across the clearing with startling clarity. "Big dog helped me. Bad man hurt me." The adults exchanged meaningful glances over her head. Emma's scattered memories were already providing crucial evidence about her ordeal. Someone had taken this innocent child, done unspeakable things to her, and left her to die in these merciless woods. Martinez felt the familiar fire of righteous anger burning in her chest. She had dedicated her career to protecting the innocent, and Emma's case would not go unsolved. Somewhere in Millfield lived a monster who had stolen a child's innocence and nearly taken her life. Martinez made a silent promise as she watched Emma finally being loaded into the ambulance. Still clutching Zeus's collar, she would find the bastard responsible and make sure he never hurt another child again. Forrest had given up its secret, but Emma's real ordeal was just beginning. Detective Sarah Martinez stood in the sterile hospital corridor, watching through the observation window as Dr. Amanda Foster worked with Emma Rodriguez. The little girl sat curled in a hospital bed that seemed to dwarf her tiny frame, clutching a new stuffed animal while speaking in whispers too quiet to hear. Every few minutes, Emma would stop talking entirely and stare at the wall with those haunting, two old eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. "She's been through hell," Dr. Foster said quietly, stepping out of the room and closing the door behind her. The child psychologist's usually composed demeanor showed cracks of exhaustion and concern. The fragmented memories, the way she flinches at sudden movements, the night terrors. This child has experienced severe trauma. Someone definitely hurt her, Detective. Martinez felt her jaw clench as she scribbled notes in her leather-bound notebook. "What exactly has she told you?" "I need something concrete to work with, Doc. Anything that might help us catch this bastard." Foster glanced back at Emma, who was now arranging her stuffed animals in what appeared to be a protective circle around herself on the bed. "She keeps mentioning the bad man and the big dog. She says the man was mean and scary, that he made her go with him. The dog, she seems both afraid of it and somehow grateful to it. It's confusing, even for someone with my experience. Childhood trauma often creates these kinds of contradictory memories." "A big dog," Martinez repeated, her detective instincts immediately cataloging this crucial detail. "That narrows things down significantly. How many people in Millfield County own large dogs? And how many of those have any kind of criminal history?" The answer came faster than Martinez had expected. Back at the precinct, Officer Janet Williams had already begun cross-referencing the county's pet registration database with the sex offender registry. The results made Martinez's blood run cold with a mixture of satisfaction and rage. "Robert Hayes," Williams announced, sliding a thick file across Martinez's cluttered desk. 45 years old, convicted 10 years ago of indecent exposure involving a minor. Lives at 247 Pine Ridge Road. That's less than 2 miles from where the girl was found. And get this, Detective, he owns a German Shepherd named Rex, registered with the county 3 years ago. Martinez opened the file and studied Hayes's mugshot from his previous arrest. His face showed the weathered features of a man who worked with his hands, but there was something in his eyes that made her skin crawl. Maybe it was just the knowledge of his past crimes, but Martinez felt her investigative instincts screaming that they had found their man. "What's his story?" she asked, flipping through the arrest reports and parole documents. "Lives alone in a trailer on Pine Ridge. Works as a mechanic at Joe's Garage downtown, but keeps to himself mostly. The neighbors say he's weird, antisocial. Perfect profile for this kind of crime." Williams paused, consulting her notes. "And here's the kicker, he called in sick to work the day Emma disappeared. No explanation, no doctor's note. Just didn't show up." Martinez felt the familiar thrill of a case coming together, pieces falling into place like a deadly puzzle. Hayes had means, motive, and opportunity. He lived close enough to have spotted Emma playing in the woods, had a history of crimes against children, owned a large dog that matched the victim's description, and couldn't account for his whereabouts during the critical time period. In her 15 years of police work, Martinez had rarely seen such a clear-cut case. "Let's pay Mr. Hayes a visit," Martinez said, grabbing her badge and weapon. The drive to Pine Ridge Road took 12 minutes through Millfield's quiet residential streets, but it felt like hours. Martinez's partner, Detective Rick Sullivan, rode in silence beside her, both of them mentally preparing for what they might find. Hayes's trailer sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by the rusted skeletons of old cars and motorcycle parts. The property looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a child predator's lair, isolated, neglected, and somehow menacing even in broad daylight. A large German shepherd began barking frantically from behind a chain-link fence as their unmarked car approached. "That's got to be Rex," Sullivan muttered, his hand instinctively moving to his service. "Weapon." The dog was massive, easily weighing over 90 pounds, with fierce yellow eyes and teeth that gleamed white against his black muzzle. Martinez could easily imagine how terrifying such an animal would appear to a 6-year-old child. Robert Hayes emerged from his trailer, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, his graying hair unkempt, and his eyes held the wild, desperate look of someone running from something. When he saw the unmarked police car, his face went pale as chalk. "Robert Hayes?" Martinez called out, her badge clearly visible as she approached. "I'm Detective Martinez with the County Sheriff's Department. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Emma Rodriguez." Hayes's reaction was immediate and telling. His hands began to shake, and he glanced nervously toward the woods that bordered his property. I don't know anything about any missing girl," he stammered, but his body language screamed guilt to Martinez's trained eye. "Where were you last Tuesday afternoon between 2 and 6 p.m.? Sullivan asked, pulling out his notebook with deliberate slowness. I was here, working. On my truck." Hayes gestured vaguely toward a rusted Ford pickup that looked like it hadn't run in years. "You can ask, ... Well, I guess there's nobody to ask. I live alone." Martinez exchanged a meaningful look with Sullivan. No alibi, no witnesses. Just a convicted sex offender with a big dog, living 2 miles from where a traumatized little girl had been found after 3 days of hell. "Mr. Hayes, we're going to need you to come down to the station for questioning," Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. As she spoke, Rex continued barking behind the fence, his massive form pacing back and forth like a caged predator. Hayes knew his life was over before the handcuffs clicked shut. District Attorney Michael Chun stood before the bathroom mirror in his office, adjusting his burgundy tie for the 3rd time that morning. At 38, he was the youngest day in the county's history, a sharp-minded prosecutor with political ambitions that stretched far beyond Millfield's borders. The Hayes case had landed on his desk like a gift from the gods, a clear-cut child abduction with a perfect villain and an innocent victim who would tug at every juror's heartstrings. Chun had built his reputation on high-profile convictions, and Emma Rodriguez's case promised to be his crowning achievement. The media attention alone would boost his name recognition statewide, positioning him perfectly for the Attorney General's race he planned to enter next year. Sometimes justice and career advancement aligned so beautifully it felt like destiny. "The evidence is overwhelming," Sean announced to his assembled team of prosecutors in the conference room. Crime scene photos covered the wall images of Emma's torn dress, the hollow where she was found, and Hayes's trailer with its ominous chain-link fence. Hayes is a convicted sex offender living within 2 miles of the victim. He owns a large German shepherd matching the child's description. He has no alibi for the time of the abduction. And most importantly, we have the victim's own testimony about the bad man and the big dog. Assistant District Attorney Lisa Park raised her hand tentatively. At 26, she was fresh out of law school and still naive enough to ask uncomfortable Questions. Sir, isn't Emma's testimony a bit fragmented? She's only 6 years old, and trauma can affect memory formation. Shouldn't we be more cautious about Park? Sean interrupted with the icy tone that had made seasoned defense attorneys wither. Are you suggesting we ignore a child victim's testimony because it's inconvenient for our case preparation? That little girl spent 3 days in hell because of Robert Hayes. Our job is to make sure he pays for what he did, not to create reasonable doubt where none exists. Park fell silent, but her concerns gnawed at the edges of Sean's confidence, like persistent termites. He pushed those doubts aside and focused on the task at hand, building an unbreakable case that would put Hayes away forever. Across town, in a cramped office above Murphy's Deli, Public Defender Jennifer Walsh stared at the Hayes file with growing dread. At 42, Walsh had been fighting losing battles for indigent clients for over a decade, but this case felt different. The community's rage was palpable, threatening to overwhelm any pretense of due process. Local newspapers had already dubbed Hayes the Woods Monster, and angry citizens had spray-painted "Child Killer" across his trailer in bright red letters. Walsh had visited Hayes in his cell that morning, and what she found disturbed her more than his alleged crimes. The man was genuinely terrified, not of going to prison, but of being falsely convicted for something he swore he hadn't done. His protests of innocence carried a desperate sincerity that Walsh's experienced ears recognized as authentic. "Mr. Hayes," she had said, sliding a legal pad across the metal table between them, "I need you to think very carefully about Tuesday afternoon. Where exactly were you? What were you doing? Is there anyone at all who might have seen you?" Hayes ran his hands through his graying hair, his eyes red from crying. "I was working on my truck, trying to fix the transmission. I've been unemployed for 3 weeks since Joe laid me off. The truck's been broken for months, and I finally had time to work on it." His voice cracked with frustration. "But nobody saw me. I live alone. I don't have friends. People cross the street when they see me coming because of what happened 10 years ago." Walsh knew about Hayes's previous conviction and decent exposure after urinating behind a gas station while intoxicated near a playground where children were present. Stupid, yes. Disgusting, certainly. But the prosecutor at the time had charged him with a crime involving minors to make an example, and now that conviction would be the nail in his coffin. "The prosecution is going to paint you as a repeat offender," Walsh explained gently. "They're going to say your previous conviction shows a pattern of behavior targeting children. We need something to counter that narrative." Hayes looked at her with eyes that held no hope. "There's nothing to counter it with. I made one stupid mistake 10 years ago when I was drunk, and it's followed me ever since. Nobody's going to believe me over that little girl, and I don't blame them. If I was on that jury, I'd probably convict me too." That afternoon, Walsh drove to Hayes's property to examine the scene herself. The trailer was a mess of broken furniture scattered across the yard, windows shattered by rocks thrown by vigilantes, death threats spray-painted on every available surface. Rex paced behind his fence, confused and agitated by the constant stream of strangers invading his territory. The dog was indeed massive and intimidating, just as Emma had described. But as Walsh approached the fence, Rex's demeanor changed completely. His tail began to wag, and he pressed his nose through the chain link, seeking attention like any lonely pet. This was supposed to be the vicious animal that had terrorized a 6-year-old child. Walsh examined the property with a critical eye, looking for any evidence that might support Hayes's innocence. The truck he claimed to have been working on was indeed partially disassembled, with tools scattered around its engine bay. Grease. Stains on the driveway suggested recent mechanical work. But none of this proved Hayes hadn't taken time to abduct Emma during his supposed repair session. Back at the prosecutor's office, Chun was already planning his opening statement. He had lined up expert witnesses to testify about childhood trauma and memory formation, medical professionals to describe Emma's injuries, and law enforcement officials to walk the jury through the investigation. The case would be a masterpiece of legal storytelling, with Hayes cast as the villain and Emma as the innocent victim whose courage would bring her attacker to justice. Chun practiced his closing argument in the empty courtroom, his voice echoing off the wooden benches. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence is clear and undeniable. Robert Hayes is a predator who saw an opportunity and took it. He stole Emma Rodriguez's childhood, her sense of safety, her very innocence. We cannot bring back what he took from her, but we can ensure he never hurts another child again. The trap was set, and Hayes was walking straight into it. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear over Millfield County, but the atmosphere around the courthouse was electric with tension. By 6 a.m., 3 hours before the trial was scheduled to begin, a crowd had already gathered on the courthouse steps. Protesters held signs demanding justice for Emma, while news crews from as far away as Cleveland set up their equipment on the sidewalk. The sleepy farming community had never seen anything like the media circus that Robert Hayes's trial had become. Judge Patricia Coleman arrived at her chambers 2 hours early, needing the quiet time to prepare for what promised to be the most challenging case of her 20-year career. At 55, Coleman had presided over murders, drug trafficking, cases, and corporate fraud, but nothing had prepared her for the raw emotion and public scrutiny surrounding the Hayes trial. Death threats had been made against anyone perceived as sympathetic to the defendant, and court security had been tripled. The judge reviewed the mountain of pretrial motions one final time. Defense attorney Jennifer Walsh had fought valiantly to change the venue, arguing that Hayes couldn't receive a fair trial in Millfield County. She had also filed motions to exclude Emma's testimony, claiming the child was too young and too traumatized to provide reliable evidence. Coleman had denied both motions, but the decisions had kept her awake for countless nights. In the holding cell beneath the courthouse, Robert Hayes sat on a narrow bench, his hands trembling as he stared at the concrete floor. He had lost 30 pounds since his arrest 6 months ago, his face gaunt and hollow from stress and the constant fear that permeated county jail. Other inmates had made his life a living hell. Child abusers were the lowest form of life in prison hierarchy, and Hayes bore the scars of numerous beatings despite being kept in protective custody. "They're going to kill me in there," Hayes whispered to Walsh during their final pre-trial meeting. "Not literally, but they might as well. Even if by some miracle I'm found innocent, my life is over. Everyone in this town thinks I'm a monster." Walsh looked at her client with a mixture of professional sympathy and genuine concern. She had defended many guilty men over the years, but Hayes was different. His terror felt authentic. His protests of innocence carried a desperate sincerity that made her question everything about this case. But questioning wasn't enough. She needed evidence, and evidence was exactly what she lacked. "Robert, I need you to stay strong in there," Walsh said, placing her hand over his cuffed ones. "Just tell the truth. That's all we can do." 3 floors above, District Attorney Michael Chun was holding court with the assembled media, his confident smile beaming across television screens throughout Ohio. He had dressed carefully for this moment, his best navy suit, his lucky red tie, his father's American flag pin on his lapel. This was his moment to shine on the state stage. Today, justice begins for Emma Rodriguez and her family, Chun announced to the crowd of reporters. "We will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Robert Hayes is a dangerous predator who stole this child's innocence and nearly took her life. The evidence is overwhelming, and we are confident that the jury will see through any attempts to paint this monster as anything other than what he is." Inside the courtroom, Emma's parents sat in the front row, their faces masks of barely controlled grief and rage. Maria Rodriguez had aged 10 years in the 6 months since Emma's disappearance. Her once vibrant face now drawn and pale. Carlos gripped his wife's hand so tightly his knuckles were white, his jaw set in a permanent grimace of determination to see his daughter's attacker pay. Behind them, the gallery filled with members of the community who had participated in Emma's search, neighbors who had watched her grow up, and concerned citizens who saw this trial as a referendum on their town's values. The atmosphere was charged with an almost religious fervor. This wasn't just a trial. It was a holy war between good and evil. At 9 a.m. sharp, Judge Coleman entered the courtroom, her black robes flowing behind her like the wings of justice itself. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and 150 people stood as one. The judge's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "The case of the state of Ohio versus Robert Michael Hayes is now in session." Chun rose for his opening statement, and the courtroom fell silent as death. He walked slowly toward the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 citizens who would decide Hayes's fate. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of absolute moral certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, 6 months ago, a monster walked among us. A predator who saw an innocent 6-year-old girl playing in her grandmother's backyard and decided to steal her childhood forever." Chan's voice rose with righteous indignation as he pointed directly at Hayes. "That monster sits before you today, and his name is Robert Hayes." The prosecutor painted a picture of calculated evil, describing how Hayes had allegedly stalked Emma, used his dog to intimidate her, and subjected her to 3 days of unimaginable terror. He spoke of evidence and opportunity, of criminal history, and suspicious behavior. But most powerfully, he spoke of Emma herself, the brave little girl, who would take the stand to face her attacker and ensure he could never hurt another child. When Walsh rose for the defense's opening statement, she faced a jury that had already made up their minds. She spoke about reasonable doubt, about the presumption of innocence, about the dangers of letting emotion override evidence. But her words fell on deaf ears in a courtroom that had transformed into a medieval tribunal, where the only acceptable outcome was Hayes's complete destruction. As the first witness was called to testify, Hayes closed his eyes and prayed to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore. In the gallery, Emma sat between her parents, her small hand clasped in her mother's, ready to face the man who had forever changed her life. The trap was about to spring shut. Dr. Amanda Foster had spent 6 months preparing for this moment, but as she walked Emma Rodriguez toward the courthouse entrance, her hands were shaking. The child psychologist had worked with traumatized children for 15 years, but never had the stakes felt so impossibly high. Emma's small hand gripped hers tightly, the 7-year-old's face pale but determined beneath her carefully brushed dark curls. "Remember what we practiced, sweetheart," Dr. Foster whispered as they navigated through the crowd of reporters and protesters. "Just tell the truth about what you remember. The nice judge will make sure you're safe." Emma nodded solemnly, her wide brown eyes taking in the chaos surrounding them with the strange calm that trauma sometimes brings to children. Inside the courtroom, Judge Coleman had made special accommodations for Emma's testimony. A small chair was placed in the witness box, positioned so Emma could see her parents at all times. The gallery had been cleared of everyone except essential personnel and family members. Even the court reporters seemed to lean forward with unusual attention, understanding that they were about to witness something that would haunt them forever. Emma's mother, Maria, bit her lip until it bled as she watched her daughter being sworn. The last 6 months had been a nightmare of therapy sessions, sleepless nights filled with Emma's screams, and the constant fear that her baby girl would never be the same. But seeing Emma's courage now, sitting up straight in that big witness chair, filled Maria with fierce maternal pride mixed with heartbreaking sorrow. District Attorney Chun approached the witness stand with the careful movements of a man handling delicate crystal. His usual courtroom swagger was replaced by gentle professionalism. He knew that one wrong move, one moment of perceived aggression, could turn the jury against him. The 12 citizens watching from the jury box seemed to hold their collective breath. "Emma, can you tell us your name and how old you are?" Chun asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma Maria Rodriguez," she replied, her small voice amplified by the courtroom sound system. "I'm 7 now. My birthday was last month." A ghost of a smile crossed her face at the mention of her birthday, the first genuine expression of childhood joy anyone had seen from her in months. "Emma, do you remember the day you got lost in the woods behind your grandmother's house?" Chun continued, his questions carefully rehearsed with Dr. Foster to avoid re-traumatizing the child. Emma's expression grew serious as she nodded slowly. "I was chasing a pretty butterfly. It was yellow and black, and it flew so fast. I followed it because I wanted to catch it for Abuela Rosa." Her voice remained steady, but her small hands began to fidget with the hem of her blue dress. "What happened after you followed the butterfly, Emma?" "I got lost," Emma said simply, as if stating an obvious fact. "The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't find my way back to Abuela's house. I called for Mama and Papa, but they couldn't hear me. It got dark, and I was scared." Chun felt his pulse quicken as they approached the crucial testimony. "Emma, while you were lost in the woods, did you see any people?" Emma's face clouded with confusion and fear. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair as fragmented memories surfaced like bubbles from the depths of her young mind. There was a bad man," she whispered, her voice barely audible, even with amplification. "He was mean and scary. He made me go with him." The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Several jurors leaned forward, straining to catch every word. Hayes sat frozen at the defense table, his face a mask of terror as he watched, his life being destroyed by a child's confused memories. "Can you tell us about the bad man's dog, Emma?" Chun asked, knowing this was the moment that would seal Hayes's fate. Emma's breathing became rapid and shallow, signs of anxiety that Dr. Foster recognized immediately. But before the psychologist could intervene, Emma spoke with startling clarity. "Big dog. Really, really big. Black and brown and scary teeth. But—" She paused, her young mind struggling with conflicting emotions. "But what, sweetheart?" Chun prompted gently. "But the dog was nice to me too," Emma said, her voice filled with the confusion that had puzzled Dr. Foster for months. "The dog helped me when I was cold. The dog found me when I was lost. I was scared of the dog, but the dog saved me." Defense Attorney Walsh shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is clearly confused about overruled," Judge Coleman said firmly. "The child may continue." Emma looked directly at Robert Hayes for the first time since entering the courtroom. Hayes stared back at her with tears streaming down his face, silently pleading for her to remember the truth. But Emma's traumatized mind had created a narrative that made sense to her 7-year-old understanding of the world. There had been a bad man with a big dog, and somehow the dog had both frightened and saved her. "The bad man was mean," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But his dog wasn't mean like him. The dog was good. The dog helped me." She turned to look at the jury, her innocent face carrying the weight of absolute truth as she understood it. Chun felt victory within his grasp as Emma's testimony painted the exact picture he needed. Hayes as the predator, Rex as his weapon of intimidation, and Emma as the brave survivor who would ensure justice prevailed. The fact that Emma showed some confusion about the dog's role only made her testimony more believable, of course. A traumatized child would have complicated feelings about her ordeal. But as Emma stepped down from the witness stand and walked past the defense table, something unexpected happened. She stopped directly in front of Hayes and stared at him with those penetrating brown eyes. Hayes looked back at her, his face crumpling with grief and desperation. "I'm sorry you got hurt, little girl," Hayes whispered, his voice breaking. "But I didn't hurt you. I would never hurt you." Emma tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the intense curiosity that only children possess. For a moment, doubt flickered across her features like a shadow passing over the sun. Then Dr. Foster gently guided her away, and the moment was lost. The trial was far from over, but Hayes's fate seemed sealed by the testimony of an innocent child whose confused memories would send him to prison for crimes he never committed. District Attorney Michael Chun straightened his tie and checked his notes one final time as he prepared for what he believed would be the killing blow in his case against Robert Hayes. The prosecution had presented 3 days of damning testimony expert witnesses on childhood trauma, law enforcement officials detailing the investigation, and Emma's own heartbreaking account of her ordeal. Now, for his final piece of evidence, Chun had arranged for a demonstration that would cement Hayes's guilt in the minds of every juror. "Your Honor," Chun announced with practiced confidence, "the prosecution would like to call Officer Tom Bradley and his canine partner Zeus to demonstrate the type of large German shepherd that the defendant used to intimidate and control the victim." Judge Coleman nodded her approval, though she felt a strange uneasiness she couldn't quite identify. Something about this demonstration felt unnecessary, even theatrical. But Chun had argued persuasively that the jury needed to understand the physical intimidation factor that a large police dog would represent to a small child. Hayes looked up sharply at the mention of Zeus, his face suddenly animated with something that defense attorney Jennifer Walsh couldn't quite read. For the first time in months, Hayes seemed alert, almost hopeful, though Walsh couldn't imagine why the appearance of a police dog would give her client any comfort. Emma sat in the front row between her parents, coloring quietly in a Disney princess coloring book that Dr. Foster had brought to keep her occupied during the lengthy proceedings. She had been unusually calm all morning, even chattering excitedly about seeing the police doggy that someone had mentioned in the hallway. Her parents assumed she was simply excited to see any dog, given her complicated relationship with the animals since her ordeal. The courtroom doors opened with a heavy creak that seemed to echo through the tense silence. Officer Bradley entered first, his uniform crisp and his bearing professional, followed by Zeus on a short leash. The German Shepherd was magnificent 95 pounds of muscle and intelligence, his dark coat gleaming under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. His brown eyes swept the room with the alert confidence of a highly trained law enforcement professional. Zeus moved with the fluid grace of an apex predator, his paws silent on the polished floor as Bradley led him to the center of the courtroom. The jurors leaned forward, studying the powerful animal with newfound understanding of how terrifying such a creature would appear to a 6-year-old child. Several jury members glanced meaningfully at Hayes, their expressions hardening with renewed conviction. "This is Zeus," Chun explained to the jury, maintaining a safe distance from the impressive animal. "He's a certified canine officer with the county sheriff's department, trained in drug detection and search and rescue. As you can see, he's a large German shepherd, similar in size and breed to the defendant's dog Rex. Imagine how intimidating such an animal would be to a small child who, that's him." The voice cut through Chun's carefully rehearsed presentation like a lightning bolt. Emma had dropped her coloring book and was standing on her chair, her small arm extended toward Zeus with her finger pointing directly at the dog. Her face was radiant with joy and recognition, completely transformed from the frightened child who had testified just days before. "That's him," Emma repeated, her voice ringing with absolute certainty throughout the dead silent courtroom. "That's the dog who found me." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Judge Coleman's gavel froze halfway to her bench. The jury sat in stunned silence, their carefully constructed understanding of the case crumbling in real time. Chun's mouth fell open as he watched his perfect prosecution collapse with 2 words from a 7-year-old girl. Emma scrambled down from her chair and ran toward Zeus, her parents too shocked to stop her. A trained police dog immediately sensed her. Approach and sat perfectly still, his tail beginning to wag as she drew near. When Emma reached him, she threw her small arms around his massive neck and buried her face in his fur. "I missed you, Zeus," she whispered, loud enough for the courtroom microphones to pick up every word. "You found me when I was scared. You stayed with me until the people came. You're a good doggy, not a scary doggy." Officer Bradley knelt beside Emma, his own eyes filling with tears as the truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Emma, sweetheart," he said gently, "do you remember being lost in the woods? Do you remember Zeus finding you?" Emma looked up at Bradley with perfect clarity, her trauma-induced confusion finally lifting like morning fog. "Zeus found me by the big rocks where I was hiding. I was so cold and hungry, and he was warm. He licked my face and stayed with me until you came, Officer Bradley. There wasn't a bad man. There was just me and Zeus, and being lost and scared." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters scrambled for their phones, jurors gasped audibly, and someone in the gallery shouted, "Oh my God!" Judge Coleman banged her gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. The truth had finally broken free from the confusion and trauma that had buried it for 6 months. Robert Hayes collapsed in his chair, his face buried in his hands as months of terror and despair gave way to overwhelming relief. Walsh gripped his shoulder, her own hands shaking as she realized how close they had come to convicting an innocent man. Across the aisle, Chun stood frozen, watching his career-making case evaporate before his eyes. Emma continued hugging Zeus, completely oblivious to the revolution she had just ignited. "Mama, Papa," she called to her stunned parents, "this is Zeus. He's the hero dog who saved me when I was lost. He's not scary at all. He's the best dog in the whole world." Maria Rodriguez stumbled forward, her legs barely supporting her as the magnitude of what had just happened sank in. Her daughter hadn't been abducted. There had been no predator, no monster, no criminal. Emma had simply gotten lost in the woods she knew so well, and Zeus had found her just as he was trained to do. The truth was beautiful and terrible in equal measure beautiful, because Emma was truly safe. Terrible because an innocent man had spent 6 months in hell for a crime that never happened. Judge Coleman finally restored order to her courtroom, but she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Justice had been served, but not in the way anyone had expected. The gavel's final bang echoed through the Millfield County Courthouse like a gunshot, officially ending the case that had torn a community apart and nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. Judge Patricia Coleman's voice was heavy with emotion, as she declared, "All charges against the defendant Robert Michael Hayes are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Hayes, you are free to go." But freedom felt like a hollow victory as Hayes sat in the defendant's chair, his body racked with sobs that 6 months of terror had finally released. The man who walked out of that courtroom bore little resemblance to the mechanic who had been arrested on a cold October morning. His hair had gone completely gray, deep lines etched his face like scars, and his hands shook with a tremor that would never fully leave him. Jennifer Walsh helped Hayes to his feet, her own eyes filled with tears of relief and rage. She had won the case, but at what cost? Her client was free, but his life had been systematically destroyed by a justice system that had rushed to judgment, based on fear rather than facts. Outside the courthouse, protesters who had once called for Hayes's execution now stood in stunned silence, their righteous anger replaced by uncomfortable shame. District Attorney Michael Chun faced the media scrum with the hollow expression of a man watching his political career die in real time. The reporters who had once hung on his every word now fired accusatory questions like bullets. How could you prosecute an innocent man? Didn't you have doubts about the evidence? Will you resign after this debacle? Chun's carefully prepared statement crumbled under the weight of his failures. The prosecution acted in good faith based on the evidence available at the time, he said, his voice lacking any trace of his former confidence. We are pleased that the truth has emerged and that Mr. Hayes has been exonerated. But privately, Chun knew his dreams of higher office had died in that courtroom alongside his reputation. Detective Sarah Martinez stood in her empty office that evening, staring at the Hayes case file that covered her desk like the debris of a plane crash. Internal Affairs had already scheduled her disciplinary hearing, and she knew her days as lead detective were numbered. She had violated the cardinal rule of police work. She had let emotion override evidence, had seen what she wanted to see rather than what was actually there. The phone on her desk rang, jarring her from her dark thoughts. Martinez. Detective, this is Robert Hayes. The voice was quiet, broken, but somehow lacking the bitterness she expected. I wanted to call before I left town. I don't blame you for what happened. You were trying to protect a little girl, and that's admirable, even if it nearly destroyed me. Martinez felt tears she hadn't shed in 20 years burning her eyes. Mr. Hayes, I'm so sorry. I failed you. I failed the system. I failed everything I swore to protect. You found Emma, Hayes replied simply. That little girl is alive because you never gave up looking for her. Maybe that has to be enough. Across town, in the Rodriguez family's living room, Emma sat on the floor playing with Zeus, who had become an unofficial member of their family after Officer Bradley's daily visits during Emma's continued therapy. The massive German shepherd lay on his side, allowing Emma to use him as a pillow while she watched cartoons, his gentle presence providing the security she needed to continue healing. Dr. Foster watched from the kitchen doorway, marveling at the resilience of children and the profound bond between Emma and the dog who had saved her life. She's making remarkable progress, Foster told Emma's parents, understanding that she was never actually abducted, that she simply got lost, and Zeus found her, has lifted an enormous psychological burden. She's beginning to remember being brave, rather than just being a victim. Carlos Rodriguez nodded, but his face still carried the weight of guilt that would haunt him forever. How could we have been so wrong? How could we have convinced ourselves that poor man was a monster when he never even met our daughter? Trauma does strange things to memory, Dr. Foster explained gently. Emma's mind tried to make sense of 3 terrifying days by creating a narrative that included both threat and rescue. In her confused memories, Zeus became both the scary dog belonging to a bad man and the good dog who saved her. It's actually quite common in cases involving young children. Maria Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her daughter giggle at Zeus's gentle playfulness. We destroyed that man's life based on our daughter's nightmares. How do we live with that? The question hung in the air without answer because there was no good answer. The community had acted on the most primal of human instincts, the need to protect children from predators, but in their haste for justice, they had become the very monsters they sought to destroy. 3 months later, Robert Hayes sat in a diner in Columbus, Ohio, nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and staring at the classified ads in the local newspaper. He had legally changed his name, moved 200 miles from Millfield, and found work at a small garage where nobody knew his story. But the nightmares still came every night. Dreams where angry crowds chased him through endless courtrooms while a little girl's voice echoed accusations he couldn't escape. The settlement money from his civil lawsuit against the county sat untouched. In his bank account, no amount of money could give him back his old life, his reputation, or his peace of mind. He had become a living ghost, forever haunted by crimes he never committed and hatred he never deserved. Back in Millfield, significant changes had taken root from the tragedy of the Hayes case. Detective Martinez, after serving her suspension, had spearheaded new protocols for interviewing child witnesses. The county had invested in additional training for law enforcement and prosecutors, focusing on the dangers of confirmation bias and the fragility of traumatic memory. Emma Rodriguez, now 8 years old, had grown into a confident, happy child who showed few lasting effects from her ordeal. She still played in the woods behind her grandmother's house, but never alone, and always with Zeus by her side when Officer Bradley visited. The truth had set her free in ways that justice never could have. The case became a landmark study in law schools across the country, a sobering reminder that the pursuit of justice must never be allowed to override the pursuit of truth. Sometimes the most profound victories come from admitting we were wrong. And the most important justice is the kind that saves innocent lives from our own righteous fury. In the end, Emma's 2 words in that courtroom had done more than exonerate Robert Hayes. They had reminded an entire community that truth, no matter how unexpected or uncomfortable, must always triumph over the stories we tell ourselves about good and evil.